On Sunday, a man drove 100 miles to an immigration detention facility in Dover. He then threw 3 petrol bombs at its gates before killing himself in his car. 2 people who had been inside the centre suffered minor injuries in the attack. This image, taken by a photographer on the scene, shows the attacker throwing the second petrol bomb device from his car. As you can see, it looks like a petrol canister with a firework taped to it, so not particularly high-tech, dangerous nonetheless. A wider angle shows the fire from the first device as the second one is thrown. Perhaps surprisingly, the police are not treating this as a terrorist incident, and this is how the Daily Mail reported the attack. Onlookers heard several explosions as all hell broke loose and said the suspect, who has not been named, was laughing as he threw the devices. 2 people inside the centre suffered minor injuries. A motive for the attack remains unclear. Now, given the suspect drove 100 miles to throw an incendiary device specifically at a centre known for processing migrants, I'm not sure it should be difficult to decipher a motive here. But there we are. The attack follows widespread negative coverage of migrants crossing the Channel, but it doesn't seem to have tempered headline writers in Britain. This was the Telegraph's front page the morning after the attack. Migrants side by side in hotels with public. So this is the scare story. You might have to stay in a hotel next to a migrant the day after that attack. And by the morning interview rounds, the attack had become a mere footnote to the so-called migrant crisis. Julia Hartley-Brewer is here interviewing Natalie Elphicke, the Conservative MP for Dover.
We are in extraordinary times. I mean, so many developments when it comes to this story over the weekend, not just hitting that 40,000. We know those official figures will show later today. But the horrific petrol bomb attack on the Manston Migrant Processing Centre, which did injure some, very, very frightening. The man then later went and committed suicide in his car. The pressure on hotels, about tens of thousands of these largely young men being put up in hotels. The Daily Telegraph reporting that migrants are going to be side by side with the public in hotels, instead of whole hotels being bought up. Millions, even billions over the year being spent on this. Why do you think the government hasn't got to grips with this?
Well, I mean, the small boats crisis is clearly out of control and an entirely fresh approach is now needed. What's been happening is simply not working. And I think that's for 2 reasons. Firstly, because every single attempt to get on top of this crossing is delayed or thwarted by a rag bag of people who seem to want open borders and don't seem to want us to get a grip on this particular situation.
Are you talking about the human rights lawyers, the various charities helping these people?
Exactly. We've seen people just object to absolutely everything, object to the new laws coming through, object to any agreements put in place, object to all of the efforts of the government to try and tackle this issue. And that's really not on, because it puts people's lives at risk crossing the Channel, and it also results in this absolutely uncontrolled amount of people arriving that we've now seen, as you say, 40,000 people this year alone.
So we should note, Julia Hartley-Brewer in her question did call the attack horrific, and Elphicke tweeted on Sunday that she was deeply shocked by the incident. But Elphicke didn't even mention the attack in her answer and went straight on to deliver anti-migrant talking points, which, by the way, completely went unchallenged. But that was the right-wing Murdoch-owned Talk TV. Let's see if the BBC did any better.
What we're talking about here, although we're talking about Manston, these are people who have crossed the Channel in small boats, and we're almost reaching the point where there are 40,000 people so far this year who have crossed the Channel. An attack on Western Jetfoil facility in Dover yesterday, where asylum seekers are being processed after being rescued from small boats, has again raised concerns in the region. 3 petrol bombs were thrown by a man who then killed himself. The incident followed reports that asylum seekers had entered people's homes when they came ashore looking for help. Simon Jones has been speaking to residents.
Well, it's just a joke, isn't it? It's just a joke. I mean, they say they could stop it quite easily if they wanted to, but I don't think they want to. It's just a case of economics at the end of the day.
They take a lot of risk. I mean, they must be very, very desperate. They can die, you know, they just want to be somewhere they are safe and secure.
I haven't got any sympathy for them at all. And the reason being is that a lot of them are not refugees. Come on. So no, I haven't got any time. And we've got enough problems here on our own. Our hospitals, our doctors, our schools. We just haven't got enough space for them.
They must be pretty desperate to make that journey across the Channel. But 39,000 of them this year is too much. So something has to be done.
Well, Nigel Farage was leader of the UKIP, has long campaigned on immigration. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good to have you on the programme. What do you think needs to happen now?
Well, there's a huge debate going on here about the symptoms of the problem. You know, the problem isn't that Manston isn't big enough. The problem certainly isn't that the Home Office didn't book hotel rooms. Hotels are full all over the country. I mean, goodness me, 2 weeks ago, they were even trying to book a castle in Cornwall. The problem is the sheer numbers coming. 990 on Saturday, 468 yesterday. And they're the ones that we know about.
So I was listening to that live and my jaw was just on the floor when they introduced their expert guest on a piece about a petrol bomb attack on a migrant centre being Nigel Farage. Now, that's probably the person who has done more than anyone in Britain to radicalise people against asylum seekers. And I listened to the whole interview. He was never once challenged on that. So he wasn't invited on to have a hostile interview. Do you feel bad that you're doing shows every night on GB News at 7 p.m. where all you do is list all the crimes that migrants have committed? You know, you handpick all of these crimes, and if it's by someone who's not white, then it appears on your show. If they're white and British, you don't care about it. There's no accountability there. It's inviting him as an expert. It's completely bizarre and completely unforgivable, actually, I think. Ash, have you ever seen what looks very much like a terrorist attack be reported in this way?
Yes, this is kind of a familiar characteristic of how mainstream media covers far-right terrorism. Shortly after a far-right terrorist incident, we had Newsnight getting Generation Identity on the show, being interviewed largely without challenge in a really quite cozy manner. Similarly, when you had the Finsbury Park mosque attack perpetuated by Darren Osborne, the full dimensions of that attack, the fact that he'd intended to find Sadiq Khan and Jeremy Corbyn, those things were downplayed because that would have showed that there is a connection between racist violence and a kind of right-wing paranoia in the face of left-wing and progressive politicians. So unfortunately, the coverage of far-right terrorist attacks tends to be really quite dreadful, but there's another specific reason why the press don't want to cover this kind of story properly. And that is because the level of anti-asylum sentiment doesn't really track with the numbers of people coming here claiming asylum. What it does track with is the frequency and the tenor of media coverage of the issue. And this isn't something that we're only seeing now. This was also a defining feature of the New Labour era, where you had tabloid and media scare stories, which were being picked up and reinforced by politicians responding to them. You also saw increases in racially motivated hate crime. So one example of this in the early 2000s was Peterborough. Peterborough was subject of Daily Mail exposés, Britain's asylum menace, they're all here, they've all got flashy phones and nice clothes and all the rest of it. What you then saw were a series of racist attacks, which included arson attacks, beatings with metal bars, assaults, which included concrete blocks being dropped on people. And the Conservative mayor of Peterborough at the time reinforcing this narrative of the asylum scourge by talking about Peterborough being turned into a crime-infested hellhole. And so that exact blueprint is something that we're seeing playing out right now with how Natalie Elphicke is talking about people in her own constituency. Rather than doing her job, which is representing the people who live in her community, she's feeding this anti-asylum press frenzy with all of the talking points that they want to hear. It's also something which is being picked up and run with by the Home Secretary, which is the kind of pattern that you saw under New Labour, only, nastier, meaner, and backed up with even worse policy, if that's possible. Everything that Nigel Farage has said, by the way, is total horseshit. The reason why there is so much overcrowding in asylum detention and processing facilities at the moment is because there is a massive backlog with dealing with the cases. And the backlog is not something which has a strong correlation to the number of people coming over in small boat crossings or indeed seeking asylum through other means. The backlog is because the Conservatives do not want to look like they are helping people claim asylum, whereas most people who come to this country, they do have genuine asylum claims, and the Home Office is doing their best to restrict their access to legal representation and restrict their ability to claim the asylum that they are lawfully entitled to. The only way in which you can start to change this political environment, which is a vicious circle, because the more you crack down on asylum, actually the more hostile public sentiment becomes, is for someone to be brave enough to change the conversation and say, hang on, this is all a load of bullshit. Most of the people who are coming over here have legitimate claims. There are people who are fleeing war, persecution, exploitation. People who are coming here, yes, they may be coming from France, but that's because, one, actually, most people don't. They stay in countries like France, they stay in countries like Germany, they stay in countries like Italy, but they come here because either they've got family or kinship ties, which mean that they could have support while they're here, or they have familiarity with the language, or they believe Britain's self-image that it projects around the world, that we're much more tolerant than other countries. So people come here looking for us to fulfill our duty of care, and instead what they find is a howling xenophobic shit show, because for decades now, the press and politicians have colluded to create the nastiest and most violent environment possible for people seeking asylum here.
What do you think about the decision not to investigate this as a terrorist act? I mean, I've seen some articles say, oh, well, he didn't have known connections to the far right. He didn't have like known far right literature or anything. But I mean, does he watch GB News? Because GB News at the moment is just all about how migrants are this invading horde of criminals, right? Now, obviously, GB News doesn't tell you to go throw bombs at asylum seekers. I wouldn't want to imply they did. But in terms of radicalization, the ideology behind hating migrants, seeing them as a threat and seeing them as a violent threat, actually, is in the mainstream. Did he have the Daily Express? It just seems odd to me that this isn't being called a terrorist attack. The one argument you could make is that it didn't seem very planned. I mean, it wasn't a very sophisticated device, but I wasn't aware that was actually a precondition for terrorism anyway. You know, people commit terrorist acts with knives. That's not a sophisticated device. I mean, what do you make of that decision, Ash?
You don't have to be a sociologist to know that terrorism is a constructed category of crime, because when you label something terrorism, what you say is that there is a problem here of ideological motivation, and it is bigger than the single individual or individuals who carried out this particular act of violence or this particular criminal offence. And so what gets labelled as terrorism and what doesn't is obviously hugely politically motivated and also limited. And you're right, if you were to look at this as a terrorist incident, even if it doesn't have direct links with known far-right hate organisations, you would say, well, where did he get this ideology? It's the mainstream media. And then you would have to ask questions about whether or not our mainstream media is fit for purpose and whether or not we should start introducing regulations in our media environment which allow communities the same protections that individuals are afforded. That's something which was rejected out of hand by IPSO and Ofcom after the Leveson inquiry. And it means effectively that you can smear whole communities of people with impunity because they don't have recourse to the same kinds of defamation law that individuals do. So treating this as a terrorist incident, the thing that I would say is that there are different kinds of terrorism. So of course there's the sort of top-down model of terrorism where someone gives an order and someone else carries it out. But there's also something called stochastic terrorism. So stochastic terrorism is almost like randomly generated terrorism. And it is a response to other actors in the political and media environment who make it more likely for violent acts to occur. So they don't necessarily directly incite by saying, hey, you go out and do this thing. But what they do is that they pump out misinformation, lies, smears, scaremongering type rhetoric in order to make it more likely that acts of violence happen. And I think that you definitely see that when it comes to handling of the asylum issue. I also think that you see it at the moment in the States when it comes to handling of gender identity and transgender issues. There is a pattern of language and media coverage which is alarmist, which is frightening, which casts people who are vulnerable and are in need of care as being deviant, criminal, terrorist, dangerous, not belonging here. And if you keep pumping that into the public sphere, what do you expect people to do? Because, if you believe what the media are saying, if you believe what the Home Secretary is saying, she literally said today in the Commons that there is an invasion happening on our south coast. And if you believe those things and take them seriously, well, what wouldn't you do? What wouldn't you find morally justifiable? What act of violence wouldn't you undertake to protect what you see as your homeland? So these are all consequences of an intensely racist, xenophobic, and hateful media environment, which makes acts of terrorism a lot more likely.